Can I open it up for questions, comments?
Olivier, I really appreciate the way you framed all this. And two of the things I'd like to pick up on. One, you're framing this very much in terms of global enclosures, which I think is correct. This is about enclosures. It is about the privatization of places and spaces by capital. Both the places where we produce or consume and the spaces where we make the decisions, the political decisions regarding who gets to capture the value of production and consumption. And I want to, you began to address, but I hope that we can go much more deeply here at this conference. The aspect, when you're talking about small-scale farming, the importance of small-scale farming, and that one of the points that you made were the multiple effects, positive effects on the local economy. That in fact, the food dollar after production can, if it's reinvested in the community, can be reinvested 4 and 5 times. We have a multiplier effect. I would submit that this fact has not gone unnoticed to the giant retail chains. And in fact, who are very well positioned and already moving rapidly to colonize that space, because that in fact is where the value can be captured. And so you see Walmart, for example, working very closely with small producers, Tesco, and their contracts with small local producers, providing organic food, local food, but in essence, basically capturing that dollar and taking it away from communities. So it seems to me that the other point that you made regarding this being enclosures at a food system global level, but about food systems, the enclosures are taking on the whole food system. It's not just about land. I think we all know that. But I hope that we can then also focus in this conference about where the enclosures are coming from and where the drivers for the enclosures are, particularly on the post-production stage on through to consumption, because that really is where the money is. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that. Thank you.
Can you quickly introduce yourself?
I'm sorry. My name is Eric Holt Jimenez. I work with Food First.
Liz Alden-Wiley, planetarian specialist. Olivia, I'm wondering, this thing of titling keeps coming up, and I think we probably need a more nuanced approach to it. I think we're getting muddled between individualization and titling in the meaning of securing literally 2, if not 3, if not 4 billion hectares as the property of rural communities. And those of us working in the tenure sector, I think many of us, our argument is that land does have to be titled to communities. It can no longer remain in the untrustworthy hands of governments as trust lands, communal lands, various county lands, whatever they are. So I think when we have to be careful about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when we talk about what we mean by titling. They need title. They need that property to be recognized as the private property of communities. Otherwise, it continues to be at risk of being sold off by their very own governments or their elites, and also or by chiefs, if it's vested in chiefs. So, just a point.
Sérgio Sauer from Brazil, from University of Brasilia. And thank you, Olivier, for your really nice presentation. It's hard to make any question when we agree full with what you said, but 2 really brief comments. First, when you talk about small-scale farming, how about energy saving? Probably this included in your 4 or 5 points, but maybe you should develop a little bit more on that. Second, when we use concepts like food crisis, rural poverty, are we taking for granted that the land rush is about commodities and not about food? Are those concepts, food and commodity, synonymous? So maybe we should talk a bit about that, if you understand what I'm saying. They are using the argument, the rhetoric, like you said, that is for producing food, but we are talking about, what, 6 or 7 commodities: soya, ethanol, sugar, forestry. So, and when we sort of face our problem with land grabbing, I think we should make a clear distinction. We're talking about food, we're talking about commodities. That would be my second point.
Thank you, Mariam Rahmanian from the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty. I have a very quick question. When you asked what should be done, you mentioned briefly the Committee on Food Security, and I was wondering, personally, what would you like to see in the ideal world the CFS decide when it meets this October on the issue of land and investments? What would be the ideal outcome from your point of view?
Thank you for these questions, and let me try to make a few remarks in response. First of all, I think the question by Eric Holt, of course, goes far beyond the specific issue of land grabbing, and it really draws our attention to the need to work on the governance of the food chains and the need to see food systems in a much more holistic way, as not just including questions related to land and security of tenure, but also to who basically makes profit from food production and processing and distribution. I think it's a problem that has been vastly underestimated by many policymakers. When we discuss food security issues, access to food, the right to food, we usually tend to focus on the quantities produced and the various actors at the production side of the chain. And then we ask whether poor consumers have access to affordable food at affordable prices. But we forget to work on the food chain as such and the links between the two, and who actually exercises power in this food chain, in a context where the bargaining position of the weakest is often diminishing over the years as a result of large, concentrated economic actors in the food chains. And this is true in the north, but it is increasingly true in developing countries, now more and more in Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and in South Asia, where the control by these actors is increasing. But it would really lead us to a very different conference to discuss these issues in great detail. My sense is that we have to shorten the food chains and control these actors much more effectively. Second, the point by this is well taken. Yes, titling may be a slightly ambiguous concept. I was proposing that securing tenure is absolutely key and absolutely part of the solutions, but I prefer to use the word registration, certification, because titling is immediately connotated as allowing a market for land rights to develop in contexts where, in many cases, small-scale farming not being sufficiently supported, it will lead to massive migrations to the cities as farmers will sell off their land, which is not sufficiently productive, which they are unable to compete with against large plantations. And so the risk of reconcentration of land, if we develop land market rights too early, if you wish, is very real. And we have historical experiences, including following land reform schemes, that show this. You know, in Guatemala, in Chile, in Mexico, we've seen this, where land was basically privatized with the hope that it would be produced by smallholders, but smallholders were tempted to give away the land because they simply were not supported in their ability to cultivate it. But I agree fully for the need to title land, i.e. to secure it. Sergio Sauer asked me to say a few words about how small-scale farming can contribute to saving energy. I do think that agricultural practices that basically are able to recycle the waste and to practice agroforestry and a combination of plants in order to fertilize the soils with much lesser use of chemical fertilizers are much easier to practice by small-scale farmers than by large plantations. Simply because it is relatively more complex and labor-intensive. It requires farmers to be linked to the land and to know exactly what the land can offer. And it is not something that is compatible with one laborer using one tractor over 100 hectares of land. So it is in that sense that there is that small-scale farming is better positioned to practice the type of farming that is more energy saving. Let us not forget that a significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions come from farming today. At least 14% if we just look at what is happening in the fields, not even taking into account deforestation and of course the food chains, transport, conservation, packaging, processing of food. He also insists on the need to distinguish between various types of food crops, some of which are commodities for the markets, and others which can feed the local communities. I think this is a very important distinction. It is as important as the distinction between energy crops and food crops, or the distinction between various uses of land. So I think it's something we have to keep in mind, the ambiguity of discussing food crops without making those distinctions. Finally, Marianne, from the International Planning Committee, wants me to express my wishes for the 37th session of the Committee on World Food Security. This is which is going to meet in October this year in Rome, the second such session following the reform of the Committee on World Food Security, and there will be a discussion on land and investment. I think there is now a sufficiently large set of good practices in how to ensure security of tenure without being too naive in doing so, particularly by developing, as I said, a market for land rights too early. There are many ways, for example, in which the uses of land and other natural resources by those depending on the commons, right? So small herders, fishers, hunter-gatherers, for example, can be better protected in their access to those resources on which they depend, and how this can be better managed at the local level. And I think we now have lots of evidence accumulating that can take the form of good practices that could be listed in what may be...
Also partly to Lawrence and others. It seems to me, from my vantage point, that there is actually a lot of evidence in the world already. A lot of research and evidence in the world about what's happening to the food system, to the commons, to land, etc. So what does it take? How much more evidence is needed to change the system? I mean, what role can academics play? What role can policy people play? Because despite national development plans which outline all these wonderful things about tackling hunger and employment, etc., when push comes to shove, the industry spits back, the whole development industry spits back the same old formula again with just new things. Now it's climate resilient, climate ready, climate smart, gender mainstreaming, it's the same old stuff that keeps coming back. So what's needed? What does it take to change the system?
University College Cork. Thanks, Olivia, for such a fascinating presentation. I just wanted to perhaps shift a little bit of attention to another one of the actors, which you touched on, but not in any great detail, which is the role of the state, particularly governments in developing countries, and the examples I have in mind are largely from Africa. Whereas we can understand the motivations of the multinationals, of the advanced nations and so forth, explaining the decisions that are made at the level of national government. What are the multiple pressures on governments, for example, in Africa? What explains these somewhat rather perverse decisions that are being made, I think is a critical priority. Now, you set out the multiple benefits of small-scale agriculture, a perspective which I think I would share myself. But we know this is under severe critique, interestingly, both from right and left. And of course, in many perspectives, the role of small-scale agriculture is not simply to improve the welfare of peasants, but to produce food for surplus extraction, for investment in other sectors, for foreign currency, and for feeding the cities and so forth. So there are multiple pressures, I think, on governments. And that presents us with both an intellectual question, which is how do we explain and understand the nature of decision-making at the level of the national state, and a political question: what can be done? What can be done to change the decision-making matrix of government so that they take on board the kind of analysis that you're...
I'm trying to look at the Secretariat of the International Land Coalition. I mean, I think what we're seeing very clearly is a lot of these the future is being driven by investment and the decision that the private sector is taking. So I wanted to come back to Olivia on the sort of closing statements in outlining a very compelling future vision for the future of agriculture. If I understood you rightly, you basically said it's incompatible with the motivations of the private sector. And I think that's really a key question to be considered. How does one engage? Firstly, is it possible to engage with the private sector? Are they completely incompatible? Or the investment that would be needed to motivate people from the private sector to fit within the vision that you inquired, the costs of that, can other players put in those costs, or can governments create frameworks that will push them in there? I mean, I'm just trying to like you to dig a bit deeper as to whether you think it's fruitful going down some form of engagement with the private sector and looking for responsible investment that is on the terms of local people and not on the terms of...
My name is Teo Balvik from Berkeley, and I wanted to ask you, I thought it was a great presentation, I wanted to ask you about this emphasis on the local, because it seems when we're talking about small-scale agriculture, we're also talking about small-scale power holders, and in a lot of places it seems that the sort of local forces are just as ravenous and destructive as the global forces that we're mostly talking about. So I think it presents sort of a paradox of, you know, protecting local small-scale agriculture from the local small-scale mafias, militias, chiefs, etc., whatever, however you want to put it.
My name is Anna Ansels, and I recently moved to the same university as Olivier. Actually, my question follows up on the last one. We have a pretty good idea of who the investors are, but I think what we're kind of like forgetting is who are the small-scale peasants and what type of subgroups do we have among those small-scale peasants. And for example, when you talked about stimulating cooperatives, but what is the risk that that cooperative initiative will be captured by a specific group of small-scale peasants? Because obviously, often we're talking about 60 or 70 or 80% of the population. So who are they?
I'm Alberto Alonso from the Institute of Agrarian and Rural Studies of Guatemala. Very briefly, Mr. de Schutter, you remarked the importance about export restrictions as a way to secure local and national food security needs. What happens in the cases when the export-oriented agricultural products are not necessarily readily edible items, such as crude palm oil, raw sugar, rubber, and so on? And second, very interesting about these anti-eviction laws. What strategies or routes would you recommend for, let's say, elites and narco-controlled, liberal-oriented, constitutional, post-colonial republics to adopt such legislation? How can we force, or how can we work into that kind of legislation?
My name is Donald Sawyer from the Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Brasilia, also Brasilia. Thank you very much for this opportunity to hear a fantastic synthesis of old and new issues. There's one new issue that I think could be expanded upon maybe at this conference and the next one that has to do with environment. I was getting a little concerned that Olivier was not going to touch on environment or ecology. I think that the small-scale farmers can be part of sustainable landscapes, socio-ecological landscapes, with very important environmental benefits in terms of maintaining ecological functions with regard to biodiversity, with regard to maintaining carbon stocks and the flows of water, not only surface water, but also atmospheric flows of water, which can be very important for everyone, including agribusiness. And those benefits are just incomparable when compared to the negative impacts of monocultures and cattle raising, as in Brazil, where the subsequent use of the land involves emissions of methane from cattle or nitrous oxide from the crops. I would also like to add that we shouldn't think only of forests, but that non-forest areas like the savannas in central Brazil, the Cerrado, can be just as important, if not more so. And it seems to me that this environmental dimension could be a great opportunity to mobilize political support and financial support for small-scale farming given the current environmental crisis in the world?
I'm Maria Spiedemer from the Vrije University in Amsterdam. Well, I would like to partly support your appeal, but also point to the danger that also the environment can be used as an excuse for land grabbing, and it's happening also at an increased scale. But I also would like to go back to the issue of registration. And I think we need to be careful to make a distinction between official registration or recognition of ownership and the actual control that people have over land. In South African land reform process, we've come across communities that officially own land but do not control land because government wants them to cooperate with private sector partners. But also has to do with what Anselm said, that also within communities, it does not prevent land grabbing within communities. But thanks for a very inspiring presentation and article. So.
Thank you again for a very rich set of remarks. Luckily, some overlap a little bit. And let me begin with the question of Shali. I hope I got your name right. Which asked really what can be done in the face of all this evidence accumulating that things are going in the wrong direction and that action is required. I think the very distressing reality is that there are actually few allies that are in a position to make things change. Investors from the north, countries that are capital rich but resource poor and that wish to secure their future food supply, want basically large-scale investment to be seen as a solution. The target countries believe that they will not be able to develop agriculture unless they call in foreign capital to do the work of creating irrigation systems, for example, to providing better access to markets, to provide subsidies for inputs, etc. So and of course many of them are corrupted, and so they have an interest in things going on as they are. And even within local communities, the power is usually quite centralized, not exercised democratically, and many local chiefs can be tempted to sell out the rights of their communities. Some of them are even waged, salaried persons paid by the government, and who lose their wages once they oppose governmental policies. Some of them are just not well equipped, legally literate enough to negotiate. And there are very few examples where they could actually resist the demands imposed on them. So you see, even if we move beyond the bilateral relationship between investor and target governments and develop this into a triangular relationship in which local communities would have a say, it remains very difficult to have things opposed. So I think that is why we need to put forward an alternative to show that there's another way to develop agriculture than by bringing in these investors for this type of farming. It is not necessarily easy because it looks like something more of the long term, and the question of Edward and the question of, again, I'm not sure whether I got your name correctly, Tar from Berkeley. I didn't note your name correctly down, but those questions were about whether we can count on governments in developing countries, right, to protect the rights of land users and to ensure that agricultural development is really poverty reducing in the rural areas. Well, as far as I can say from the conversations I had with governments in developing countries, there are basically three major problems that make it difficult to count on them, really. One is basically a cultural prejudice against peasants, right? In the French language, in my language, peasant is negatively connotated, and that tells you something, right? They are seen as backwards, they are often seen as not worthy partners in the discussion, and they do not, for this reason, count in the minds of these local elites. Secondly, there is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy at work with regard to small-scale farming. Governments have not invested in small-scale farming in the past, as a result of which the prejudice against small-scale farming, the idea that it is not productive, is deeply ingrained and reinforced by past experiences. And so, and that is self-fulfilling prophecy because there was no belief that they could achieve decent levels of productivity, that there was no investment going in this type of farming, so that this reinforces the stereotypes about small-scale farming. And thirdly, there is very simply a sort of unilinear idea of progress, right? Modernization in agriculture means mimicking what has been done in the north, a large-scale, heavily industrialized, heavily mechanized types of agriculture that economize on labor and are very capital-intensive, right? That is what you hear as a vision in the speech of many elites in developing countries. And this, of course, negates the fact that we are now in the 21st century, not the 20th century, with very different demands placed in agriculture. And this, of course, negates the fact that the local conditions are very different, and that, as again, Tanya Lee emphasizes in her contribution to the GPS issue, it is based on the presumption that there will be sufficient job creation in the industry and services sectors that can be an alternative source of livelihoods and incomes for farmers who are expelled from their land, which I think is not realistic. Although I do think that economies in the south must be diversified, and that agriculture is only one sector in which we have to invest for developing countries to develop. But so these governments are generally very difficult to count upon, and the key, therefore, to overcome this is to simply give more say in the decision-making process to the organizations of small-scale farmers. And for me, one of the most promising developments is the rise and increased influence of unions of small farmers in regions such as West Africa, where this is being most spectacular, but in other regions this is also developing, where they are becoming interlocutors which the governments cannot ignore. And for me, an adequate legislative framework that establishes fora in which consultations should systematically take place between governments and civil society representatives, including in particular farmers' organizations, can play a very important role in this regard. And I think democratization of decision-making is absolutely key, and that is, my friends, what the right to food is about. It's about improving the ability for small farmers to weigh into the decisions that concern them and that relate to food and agriculture. And that, in my view, is the only way to unlock, if you wish, the current blockages. Michael Taylor from the International Land Coalition raises a very different question, which is what role, if any, for the private sector in food systems that are more sustainable, more localized, and better capable of reducing rural poverty. When I mentioned that there were few incentives for investors to invest in those systems, I was thinking of the large investors based in the north who primarily seek to produce food to serve the global markets, to serve their consumers in the high-value OECD markets, if you wish, where most profits are to be made. But then they are not the only actors from the private sector. The private sector is much broader, and indeed you could say that small farmers are the private sector, if you wish. And there are many local retailers, food processing companies, companies that can link the consumers to the producers, or the other way around, that could have a role in developing these systems. The key point here is that much greater attention should be paid to how these food chains are governed and how the bargaining positions of respective actors are checked. In many developing countries, for example, there is no serious competition law, there is no antitrust legislation that can avoid abuses of dominant positions in certain sectors. And in some cases there are such laws, such as South Africa has a competition law 1988 that is being used, for example, against the dairy sector's abuse of its position vis-à-vis the producers of milk. But that is an exception, and the rule is there is basically no possibility for governments to control the way small farmers are being cheated, basically, by excessive buyer power in the food chains. And so this kind of thing requires a very strong governance by the governments, and that we pay our attention to the food chains. But yes, the private sector has certainly a role to play. And the reason why Eric Jimenez was asking about the interest of north-based large retailers in these developing food systems in the south is precisely because these food systems are now attracting greater attention. And I believe that this is a good thing, that greater attention is being paid to these food systems, but we should avoid the risk that excessive power will be exercised by some major players in these food chains, and that is really an issue of governance that has to be addressed. And Anderson's asked about cooperatives, which indeed sometimes, as we all know, have a bad reputation in many countries. For the 1960s and 1970s, there were often state-led cooperatives that were cheating farmers out of the value of their production, and that were forcing farmers into certain types of crops and into certain types of production at the denying their ability to choose what to produce and for whom to produce. Cooperatives, however, have developed bottom-up in the 1980s and 1990s, at the same time that the state retreated from agriculture. And if they are transparently managed, if they are democratically organized, if the management is indeed controlled by the stakeholders, by the farmers concerned, they can have tremendous benefits. And I believe that some economies of scale are important to achieve in negotiating prices for input providers and for the buyers of crops, that some economies of scale can be achieved in the processing, the marketing of food, and for this cooperatives can be extremely important, provided they are adequately controlled. So I would not be too pessimistic about this, but I do agree that there is always a risk of capture by certain farmers at the expense of others. Alberto Alonso from Guatemala expressed a robust, healthy skepticism towards anti-eviction laws. So the point is actually very simple. Once you depend on land for your livelihood, you should have a right to complain when you are evicted from the land that you occupy, without even having to prove that you have some title that is, legally recognized as that legally recognizes you, defines you as the owner. That is what anti-eviction laws are about, to ensure access to remedies every time a person is deprived from access to the resources on which he or she depends for his or her livelihoods. And it is a way to immediately protect land users from evictions without having to go through the very lengthy and potentially difficult process of titling whatever form this titling or this registration or this certification takes. Can it work in Guatemala? Frankly, you're much better positioned than I am to assess this. But of course, the effectiveness of such legislation is dependent on the quality of local governance and on the ability for the local institutions to protect land users. And unfortunately, it is not a magic bullet. None of us has, I believe, such a magic bullet to offer. Finally, there was a question from one member of the Brazilian delegation, I'm sorry that I missed your name, about the environmental benefits of small-scale farming. Yes, absolutely. I actually presented just a month ago at the Human Rights Council in Geneva a report on agroecology and the right to food that basically tries to explain the wide range of techniques that are resource conserving and that can de-link food production from the dependence on fossil fuels. And I tried to press the point to governments that this was something that deserved to be supported in the future. We simply have no other way, if we want to feed ourselves, to develop food systems except by de-linking food production from the dependence on oil and gas. And if we continue to accelerate climate change, for which agriculture is partly responsible, we will find it extremely difficult in the next 30, 40 years to maintain actual levels of production. So I think the governments were actually quite receptive, and there were 6 hours of discussion in Geneva on this report, with a large number of governments intervening, overwhelmingly supportive, and a resolution adopted that actually encourages states to follow the recommendations of the report. And it's not usual that the Human Rights Council goes as far in supporting the report. Although I have to say that at the beginning of the day, my impression was that some governments were just learning the term agroecology. But yes, in that report, I am advocating for this, and I did not emphasize this point basically because I wanted to have more time for the discussion. Thank you.